where does the word salamanca process come from? We can only understand it if we look back in history and the story in history of the Dominicans. So it goes back more than 500 years. In the 16th century, when Spain was colonizing Latin America, they went and one of the first places of where they stopped was in what's today the Dominican Republic and Haiti, that area, on the islands there. And there was a Dominican community set up in what's today called the capital of Dominican Republic. Who knows what that city is? Santo Domingo. So what do you notice? All those names are very Dominican names. Okay? So Dominican Republic, the capital Santo Domingo, and that's where the first Dominican community was set up, because the Dominicans accompanied those who were colonizing. They went with the Spanish colonizers, and they were there in some ways, of course, normal chaplains, on voyages and things like that. But after a while, the Dominicans began to notice what the colonizers were doing. And they were horrified to see how they were treating the indigenous people in the places where they were. So, as a community, they reflected a lot on this. The prior of the community's name was Pedro de Cordoba. It's quite a famous name. And there were several of them, but as a result of that discussion, they felt they needed to say something. So they, as a community, appointed one in their midst who they thought was the best preacher. His name was Antonio de Montesinos. Have you heard of that name? Yes. Antonio de Montesinos. And one day in the church, he gave a sermon. And it's a very famous sermon. It's called the Montesinos sermon. And of course, in the presence of all the leaders of the colonial operation there, he said to them, "You are treating the local people as though they're not really human. By what right can you treat them in that way? Do you not realize that they are human beings like you and me? And what you're doing is despicable. It's terrible. We have to change. We have to stop that. Because these are people born in the image of God like you and me, and we have to treat them as equal human beings." Of course, that provoked the wrath, the anger of a lot of the Spanish colonizers. And many of them tried to get rid of those Dominicans there after that. But they continued, and they continued to send reports of what was happening there back to Spain. One of the people who joined them afterwards was Bartolome de las Casas. Have you heard that name? Yes. Some of you heard that name. Yes. He's probably the most famous because he eventually became the bishop of Chiapas, in Chiapas, and he in Mexico, the southern part of Mexico, and he was the bishop of that whole territory in Central America, southern Mexico, etc. And we're now actually hoping that he will be beatified in the near future. There's some questions about that, but he's probably the most prominent person from that period. Now, when they were sending these reports back, in Spain, we had a strong Dominican presence in the universities, especially the University of Salamanca. And the head of that theological faculty there was named Francisco de Vitoria. Have any of you heard that name?
Yes.
Now, Francisco de Vitoria, he was, being the chair of theology, philosophy, it's difficult to pin him down to one discipline, even in law. He didn't do it alone, together what was called the Salamanca school. So a whole lot of other Dominicans and other people, it wasn't only Dominicans, they were reflecting on what was coming from Latin America. And what the big thing, and De Vitoria was the one who articulated and formulated the response more particularly. He recognized that there were no laws which could restrain or to which the Spanish colonizers were accountable when they went to that area. Because all laws at that stage were just national laws. Laws applied just to your particular nation. And he recognized there was a big gap now. There are no laws to regulate what people do when they go to another nation. There was no law to govern the relations between nations. So people could just do what they want. That's why the Spanish could just do what they want with impunity when they went to Latin America. So he started formulating principles for what we call the law of nations. And the modern way which we describe it would be international law. So Francisco de Vitoria is recognized, even in the UN context, as the founder of international law, or the law of nations. And even in the UN, he's recognized as such. So if you go to, have any of you been to the UN in New York? None of you? In the garden in the UN in New York, there's a statue of Francisco de Vitoria, and it's written there, Fundador de Derecho de Gentes, the founder of the law of nations. In Geneva, now Geneva was the first place where was set up the multilateral organization to bring nations together after the First World War. That's where all the nations, many of the nations who were involved, they decided to stop this war happening again. They set up, and who remembers what the international multilateral thing is called? The League of Nations. Did you ever hear of the League of Nations? It was set up after the First World War, and it was based in Geneva. The reason it was based in Geneva was because of the Red Cross, which was founded in Geneva. It was the main place where brought countries together there. So it became like a center for international operation. So they set up the League of Nations in Geneva, and they built the first building. And one of the council chamber in that building is called the Saal, or the Hall of Francisco de Vitoria. So just to show you that from the earliest times, he was recognized. So one of our Dominicans is seen to be there at the beginning of what has become the United Nations. Of course, the League of Nations collapsed 20 years later, after the end of the First World War. When the Second World War broke out, the League of Nations collapsed. Good morning. And then only after the Second World War, they set up the United Nations. And they made the head office in New York, but Geneva remained another important center. It's probably the second most important center for the United Nations, but that's where the Human Rights Council, which is based, and that's why we decided to be there, because we felt as Dominicans we need to be involved, especially at the level of human rights, because that's where we can contribute. We've been there since forever, in focusing on issues of human rights and the dignity of every person. That's where we felt we had something to contribute. There are two other UN centers as well, international ones. One's in Austria, in Vienna, where they focus on drugs and crime, and also on atomic energy and things like that. And the fourth one is in Nairobi in Kenya, where the focus is on environment. There's a UN environment program, a UN settlement or housing program, UN Habitat. So that's what the UN has become, but just to say that Francisco de Vitoria and the Dominicans were there at the beginning because they started formulating these principles for international law. And what the UN is, it's a space where all the nations come together, and basically we're trying to establish international law, international norms to regulate what countries do. So that's why we Dominicans have been here from the beginning. So because Salamanca, the School of Salamanca was so important in this process, that's why 9 years ago, when the Dominican, in our general chapters, and in the last 9 years, 3 general chapters since then, there's been a lot of focus in our general chapters and in the Dominican order on the importance for us to recover the spirit of what study meant in our Dominican order. It's not a new thing. It's always been there, but often the understanding got a little bit lost. Often when we spoke about our academic institutions, they became like elitist things, ivory towers, where people were talking about, you know, all sorts of ideas and principles and things, but without a connection to what was happening on the ground. So often they became very elitist institutions, divorced from the rest of society. And especially when it came to the issue of theology, people started talking about all sorts of theological things, about angels and about spirituality and about things, but it had no connection to what was happening on the ground. That's why in the latest general chapters in the last 9 years, there's been a strong focus that we need to recover the type of methodology that was used by our brothers in Salamanca 500 years ago. And what that methodology basically was you start by hearing and listening to what's happening on the ground. And when you hear that, it forces you to start thinking now, what does theology mean? Or what is God saying in response to that? So our theological work and all our academic work ultimately, there's some chairs here if you want. Here we are. There's a free chair here.
From Salamanca. Looks nice.
So, welcome. We're talking about Salamanca Press. So, are you Salamanca? What name is it?
I'm Budo.
Budo, okay, that's a bit different from Salamanca. Welcome. So, when we're talking about the Salamanca process, what are we talking about? We're talking basically about ensuring that our study, especially of theology, is rooted in a reflection on the questions that are being posed by the people and the communities within which we are working. And of course that community is local, but it's national, it's global. So we are wanting to, our first question is, what are the questions people are asking? Or they wanting a response to? So to do that, we have to have a direct connection to the ground. And I think you're already doing that in UST a lot. The fact that you have all these community development coordinators, and your role, as I understand it, is precisely to be identifying communities and to help their questions to come here so that you can respond to them. So